Okay, and now I'd like to pass over to Michael Bangay, who's going to, I guess, take some of that discussion about the estimated or predicted levels to the point where it's all tested and we find out what it really is like. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to share with you the results of our audit of at least 10 base stations. There was a particular concern that the levels were getting up. We needed to look at those sites and see what the actual levels were. There were some measurements undertaken by myself and Dr. Philip Knight from Total Radiation Solutions, a NATA accredited organisation, and so that these measurements that I'm presenting today are traceable and the work can be quite trusted in that regard. We are independent. We do the work on a set of procedures that have been audited by the National Association of Testing Authorities. Well, we had some very clear objectives in mind. Of course, it was to see whether the levels had actually increased and to look at these particular sites where the levels were as much as 8% of the Radiation Protection Standard number 3, the APANSA standard. I guess we were really wanting to show that wherever we went, we could show compliance with the limits that are there in Radiation Protection Standard number 3. So it was important to do the measurements to see whether the standard was not being exceeded. The other thing was to validate what we call the APANSA prediction report. We just heard a bit of a mention of that. For every one of the sites around Australia, the base stations, indeed broadcast as well, there is a report that gives a level of exposure in the near vicinity of a base station or a particular site. And so we needed to be sure that that was actually predicting believable levels, that there was some sort of tie to reality with those base station, those reports. The other important thing is that because the industry is driving much of this reporting, it was important from the public's perspective that the levels were being audited, validated by an organisation outside of the industry. And so NATA accredited laboratories are able to do this work if it's within their scope, and that's something that TRS do. The other thing is that we wanted to particularly home in at the level, find the level that was the highest around a site, and that was very much predicted in the APANSA report, and I'll show you that in just a moment. We had a methodology that we needed to follow. Of course, it was measurement of radio frequency electromagnetic energy, different frequencies, different services. And we were going to look at the site that was, at these range of sites where the level was going to be the highest. The intention was to measure the level of radio signal related to a particular kind of technology, whether it be here, GSM, LTE or WCDMA or the 3G UMTS. So we're able to identify each particular technology and make an assessment of that technology. When we look at the signals associated with those technologies, embedded within that signal is a level that remains unchanged irrespective of the amount of traffic that's being coming to and fro that particular site. So it's possible if we do that measurement of what we call a control channel or pilot tone or reference signal, we're able to then to make an estimate of the highest level possible coming from that site. We're constrained, of course, during the course of the day to go when we can get access into the area and not at night. And so it's important that we do a measurement of these reference levels and then extrapolate them to get the highest possible level. So that was an important thing that we needed to report as well. So this is the APANSA report. I think I had part to play in producing this report some 15, 20 years ago when they first came out. So things have changed through the years, and it's changing still, as is the public having input into this sort of information, want more clearer information. So we can see that we have a report that sets various distances and does a calculation of worst case exposure level at particular distance. And then it identifies a particular distance out from a base station where the level is going to be the highest. So looking more closely at that, we find that this particular site at Abbotsford here in Melbourne, that it's at 41 metres away from the base station directly out in front of the antennas, that the worst case level of 5.2% is actually predicted for this site. So we're going to test this, actually set up our measuring equipment at that particular point and see what we measure. Now, it's important to understand that this is worst case predictions. So we have an important note that comes on the report, and I'm not sure whether everybody reads this, but really is saying that this estimate is very conservative. There are all sorts of issues about the site being fully loaded, about having clear line of sight, and about not including attenuation. So there's a lot of things. So it would be reasonable that when we go and do a measurement, we'll be finding something quite below what is estimated for this particular site. Of course, when you get out to a site, you find that there is a new building, a whole stack of trees, cars in the way, and so the reality is quite difficult to get to this particular point here. We can't quite get there. So let's have a look at a site that is out the northeastern suburbs, and we're looking here a restaurant, and most of these high levels, might I say, are coming from, not from towers, but from commercial buildings primarily that have antennas put on the top of them. So this was a restaurant. There was a car park. Fortunately for me, at this particular point, which was around about 40 metres away, I was able to set up my measuring equipment. The antennas were providing coverage down this part of this roadway here, so that I guess it was for people stopped at the lights primarily, and also the areas all around here for people using the mobile phones, a small commercial area. So I went to this particular point. The actual level was identified, so as I say, with this particular piece of software called RF map, I'm able to set up my measurement equipment at the particular point where RF map has predicted the maximum to be. And the RF map has the APANSA algorithm built into it, so the calculation can truly produce an estimate based on what APANSA have laid down. So we try as much as we can to find a line of sight transmission path. One of the realities, of course, is that there are many radio signals out there in the background. And so when we go out to do a measurement, if we're going to look particularly at base stations, we need to take into account there are many other signals and exclude them. Now, this is a particular site. This is in North Ringwood, 24 kilometres to the east of here, about 12 kilometres from Mount Dandenong. So let's have a look at some of the signals that are there at this particular site. This was around about 300 metres from two base stations and about 400 metres from a Wi-Fi smart meter base station as well. So we find there the FM radio was probably the highest signal, and that was coming from Mount Dandenong 12 kilometres away. VHF TV, UHF TV, then we've got the 850 WCDMA, the GSM 900 frequencies, and then 1800, which really was an LTE operating from that site. It was no GSM from that site, it was just an LTE. So this is, if you like, a new base station running LTE. There's 2100 UMTS, and then from that, a smart meter base station was the WiMAX. Now, the ratio of all these signals will vary depending where you are around town. You could be close to a base station, you might be close to a broadcast site. There's any number of variations. But let's have a look at the pie chart that divides these signals up. So looking at those measurements taken there from North Ringwood, I come to an overall exposure level of 0.13% of radiation protection standard number 3, the general public limit. So it's quite low. Might I say that figure of 0.01 to 0.1 is around about what I find around Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne, around about 0.1, depending on where you are, mainly made up of what comes from broadcast sites. So in this particular pie chart, where I am, it's 12 kilometres from Mount Dandenong, we find that 66% of the EME that I'm measuring comes from public broadcast. A smaller amount from AM, which was some distance away, but because of the way AM is treated within the standard, it doesn't contribute much to exposure. Whereas FM has a far more strict limit applied. Thank you. So that's a pie chart. This is what we measure around a base station, primarily made up of signals, GSM and WCDMA signals coming through. There, at this particular site, I measured 0.43. What was predicted for that site was 8%, so it's significantly less. When I looked across all of the sites, I find that the actual levels that I'm actually measuring were around about 0.5% of radiation protection standard number 3, whereas the average of the predicted level was over 3.5%. And the extrapolated worst case, if you took that into account, which is a peak level, was around about 0.9% of the standard. Across all of the sites, you get this kind of variation, and it varies, but the averages, as I showed you earlier, somewhere around about here. And these are the, if you like to say, the worst case estimates for sites around Australia. If we look at in further depth what makes up these exposures, we find that the old technology, which has a full power transmitter running 24 hours a day, contributes to the highest level. We would expect within a couple of years that GSM will be retired and that given over to the new 4G technologies. You can see here that LTE really is a smaller amount of the overall exposure. So there's the conclusions, that the predicted values given in the APANSA standard are 7 times above what we measure, and that the predicted levels are 4 times greater than the extrapolated levels, even the worst case, take a peak level. That the GSM technology contributes 49% of the measured RF EME when you're close to a base station. So therefore we can say that the APANSA Environmental Prediction Report provides a conservative estimate of RF EME of levels around the base stations. Thanks for your time. And the last slide is gone. Thank you.